Good morning. I'm so happy to see all of your faces. This is we're going to learn a little bit, in a way that we haven't quite learned before, slightly different. And because what I've done is I've selected two pieces of Talmud as opposed to one, mostly because I think it adds interesting background story. And we're learning as each week we're sort of connecting it to the parsha. This week we come to the last parsha of the book of Genesis. Chazak, chazak, v'nid chazek, right? Strength, strength, we should be strengthened. That's what we say at the end of the book of reading a book of Torah. And today is no different. So first of all, I want to just sort of name, I think except for the week of Thanksgiving, we've learned every week this 5783 or just about. So as I said, I love New Year's. I love the opportunity to start over. So today is no different, a chance to like mark something I think important. So really just a pleasure to learn together. Okay. So in the last week of the last parsha of I was going to say Masechet Breshit, but it's not Masechet, Sefer Breshit, is the sort of resolution of Joseph's story. Joseph's returns home with his children, and Jacob dies, but not before blessing his two grandchildren as well as Ephraim and Manasseh, and then the rest of his male children, gives them sort of these cryptic blessings. And I thought that maybe we would explore those, but I decided against that this week. But there's lots of interesting stuff with the blessings and worthy of exploration. But then we get to the end, and we're going to read it. We're going to read the biblical text first today, because I want to do something. We're doing something a little different, in which Jacob has made Joseph promise not to bury him in Egypt, where they are currently residing, but instead to bury him in the land of his ancestors in Canaan, or Eretz Israel. So let's look at that. What I've done this week, a little different, is I have a source sheet. I'm going to make this a little smaller, from Safaria. And so what I'm going to do is here, for those who are interested, I'm dropping it in the chat. You don't have to look at the chat. I'm going to share my screen. But if you wanted to look at it, it's there to look at. Okay? Let's make this a little bigger. That a little smaller. Can everybody see this? Okay, give me a thumbs up. Yeah, too big, too small? Okay, great. So it's a little wonky in terms of sizing and stuff, because it's not like our normal sheets, but I think it's fine. Okay. So the last verse of Genesis 49, the penultimate chapter, it sort of feeds into the next chapter, and I wanted to include it. Jacob says, and Jacob finished his instructions to his sons, and he drew his feet into the bed, and breathing his last, he was gathered to his kin, namely, he died. And then we have the next part of the story, which is Joseph. Can I get a volunteer to read this biblical text? These first 6 verses of chapter 50. Can I get a volunteer? Yeah, Bill. Oh, let's unmute you first.
Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph ordered the physician in his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. We didn't know that. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days. And when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, "Do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave which I have made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father, then I will return." And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you promise an oath."
Thank you, Bill. Okay, so we got a couple things happening here. We're going to predominantly focus on the bottom half. The first half, right? Joseph begins his grieving process. He weeps, he kisses his father, and then Joseph has his father treated, with death rituals, with embalming, things like that. And we have a whole description here of 40 days. The Egyptians bewailed him for 70 days, things like that. And again, I just want to sort of highlight for you those important numbers in rabbinic thinking, where the rabbis derive these biblical numbers, 40 and 70. We see these a lot. And we're going to talk about the 70 in a moment. Once this happens, and they bewail him, and the wailing period is over, right? Now we're talking about basically 3 or 4 months later. Joseph says to Pharaoh, I made a promise. My father made me swear, right? Now I have to go and follow through on that. And the rabbis basically are going to insert themselves right here. If you can see my mouse, right in between the end of the quote and the word "and." Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return. The rabbis sort of insert what they think happens, and then Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father, as he made you promise an oath. I don't want to spoil it because it's such an interesting story, but before we sort of get into it, and we're going to talk about those last 2 verses, what do people think of this little vignette, this little story? I know we haven't studied Talmud yet, but certainly from the biblical story. Yeah, Nelson.
Precursor question. You said he brought this appeal to Pharaoh. He doesn't. He brings it to Pharaoh's court. And I was curious about that. Why can't he go to Pharaoh?
That's interesting. I didn't notice that. That's a great question. Yeah. What do you think?
He's supposed to be this high official who has access to Pharaoh. He has it all earlier in the chapter. I don't know.
He was busy.
Could be.
He was busy. I mean, he was trying to do it fast.
I'm going to make a joke that I'm going to immediately regret. But as we've learned in the United States, if you're in the House of Representatives, you shouldn't bring a vote unless you know you have the votes. Now, maybe that plays a role here, which is maybe Joseph didn't know what would happen, right? And going to the court is a safer option. Don't know. Just throwing it out there. David, what were we going to say? Now that you're chewing, what were we going to say? And then Sheila, and then Ron. Oh, you're muted.
Another response to going to the court, which is protocol. He may be the vizier and the second in charge, but you don't go past you don't skip the cabinet meeting, so to speak.
Right.
That might be it also.
Right.
But the other thing I thought is interesting that maybe the rabbis aren't dealing with, since they're focusing on a different verse, but it says embalm. I don't know what the Hebrew is for embalm. But when I've read that in the past, I've always assumed that, especially since it takes so long, that it means mummify. And that's what the Egyptians would have done with their dead, especially prominent dead. They would have mummified them. And I'm just wondering, right now we would say that even the embalming that gets done in this country, we wouldn't want to do. That's not a Jewish thing. Now, of course, this is before the Torah is actually, I mean, the laws are actually given. So maybe that's an explanation. But I think it's also interesting that it says that, and it seems like that means mummify him in the Egyptian tradition. Do the rabbis deal with that at all? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. In the moment, so generally you can do this cool thing with Safaria, which we're now using, and you can highlight words, and it will, you can get into it. I'm having trouble doing that while we're on the call, but the link is in the chat, and you should feel free to peruse. But interesting question. Yeah, I don't know the answer. Sheila, and then Ron.
Well, I mean, that's what they did. It was hot. You had to take care of the body. And remember, he's already talking. He wants to bring him to Canaan, but that's going to take at least a day or two. And you don't want him stinking up, you won't be able to drive him. But there's things that I've noticed is that in one of the places he talks about Jacob and then he calls him Israel. I think maybe that's in the paragraph before this. He drew his,
That was Jacob.
yeah, and then somewhere here,
Yeah, right
he
here.
embalmed Israel.
Yeah.
Which was interesting. What is also interesting is we usually derive our laws from what's in the Bible, right? That we sit Shiva, that we have the bris on the 8th day. And here it says one thing that, and after, you're not supposed to kiss a dead body. And yet here it says he wept and kissed him after he died. And you would think that it would not become an issue in Jewish law then. I don't know how much of an issue it is.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with a prohibition over kissing a dead body, although certainly the laws of ritual purity would play a role. What I do think we have described here is a deeply human response, right? A human response of a son grieving over the death of his father in the moment. And sort of the laws don't matter at a certain level with that.
Yeah.
The second thing I'll say is, look, I'm not a particularly knowledgeable on death rituals pre-burial by any means, but my sense is, again, this is not having read any of the commentaries on this, just sort of my own sense, is that in part it's happening because they're in Egypt. And the laws are right. He's sort of assimilated to the cultures in Egypt, and therefore we're seeing a little bit of that. But I don't know. I say that without.
Well, they haven't yet gotten really the laws when you think about it.
For sure not. And again, even if we did have the laws, we would be sort of like pulling back to these stories. But it's interesting questions and thoughts certainly.
But the 40 and the 70 is what I'm curious, because these are numbers which we would ordinarily say would apply. Okay, we're going to mourn them 40 days and then another 70 days, and we have completely different numbers for mourning.
Yeah. Well, those 40 and 70 days are definitely highlight numbers that would highlight. Ron and then Nelson, and then we're going to learn some Talmud.
Okay, well, number one, the 30 days, I think that came at Aaron when they mourned Aaron, that was 30 days. So that's where the 30 days came from. But you could also say the difference between the 40 when the body was ready and the 70 when they stopped mourning, that's 30 days. So maybe that's 30 days. But what I was going to say is what Saforno pointed out is, and I don't hold too much with this. Sforno says that he couldn't go see the Pharaoh because he was still in his morning clothes. I don't know how he didn't have enough time to change to his evening clothes by then, but
I've heard that too, that whether it was in this connection or some other connection, and it may have been in the story of Joseph somewhere around. Doesn't he have to change his clothes when he's called to, when he's in prison and he has to go before the Pharaoh for the dreams?
I don't remember either way.
Yeah, there's another case. Somebody has to change his clothes before he can go to the Pharaoh.
Absolutely, Sheila. He did. They dressed him all up before he went to see the Pharaoh.
Yeah, you don't come like a schlump.
That's good. All right, Nelson, and then we're going to study some Talmud.
Well, I was just wondering why we can't just learn the lesson that we're supposed to adopt local customs for burial.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Why can't we just draw the lesson from all this that as Jews we should adopt local customs for burial?
That's an interesting.
Joseph adopted Egyptian customs. Why can't we adopt local customs for burial?
I mean, that's probably a much larger sociological question than it is this particular one. But I do think the rabbis certainly believe in differentiation and will do things in specific to differentiate themselves from the people around them. As for why the Israelites and the Egyptians, whether, sort of thinking back in this biblical era, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. All right, let's move on. Let's move on. All right, so we're learning in Masechet Shabbat. In particular, this one is not going to feel related until it feels related. So forgive me if this feels like a total non sequitur. We learn in Masechet Shabbat something about I want to talk. It's about 70 languages, and we're gonna. You'll forgive me for making feel like it's very random, but it won't feel random in a minute. Can I get a volunteer to read this section from Masechet Shabbat? Yeah, Karen.
With regard to the revelation at Sinai, Rabbi Yochanan said, "What is the meaning of that which is written? The Lord gives the word. The women that proclaim the tidings are a great host." It means that each and every utterance that emerged from the mouth of the Almighty divided into 70 languages, a great host. And similarly, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught with regard to the verse, "Behold, is my word not like fire, declares the Lord, and like a hammer that shatters a rock? Just as this hammer breaks a stone into several fragments, so too each and every utterance that emerged from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, divided into 70 languages." The Gemara continues in praise of the Torah. Rabbi Hananel bar Papa said, "What is the meaning of that which is written? Listen, for I will speak royal things, and my lips will open with upright statements." Why are matters of Torah likened to a king? To teach you that just as this king has the power to kill and to grant life, so too matters of Torah have the power to kill and to grant life.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Karen. All right, so a couple of things are happening here at once. So we have this is probably more in the context of Mount Sinai. We have this verse from the Psalms. The Lord gives the word, and the women that proclaim the tidings are a great host. And here it takes the language of host, meaning sort of armies, this large amount of people, to understand that when God gives the word, as it were, that all the variety, the large amount of people means that it's divided into 70 languages, which is relevant for the conversation we're about to have, and has the number 70 in. And here we have a second.
I don't get this at all. I'm totally at loss.
Okay, are you lost because it's out of context, or you don't understand?
No, I don't understand it. The Lord gives the words. Okay. The women that proclaim the tidings are a great host. I don't understand what the great host is. It seems to imply that the women then go out. They're the journalists. They're going out and proclaiming.
So the word host is translated from this phrase, tzva rav, which is basically a large army.
Still doesn't make sense. I mean, what?
Yeah. So the analogy it's making is that a large amount of people, that the women proclaiming the tidings are a great host, meaning to say there's a large amount of people, since God and the juxtaposition between, thank you, I have clearly not had enough coffee this morning, between God giving the word, right? Hashem nitain omer, hamivasor omer, right? Gives the saying, and this army, it's the juxtaposition between the two, which is to say the large amount of people tells us that they give 70 languages.
And the women, suddenly the women, which is interesting.
It is super fascinating that it names women in particular. I didn't look at the verse specifically. So it's interesting exactly where that comes from. I don't want to get too lost in it, but it is super duper interesting. There's an alternative given if that one doesn't sort of do it for you. Rabbi Yishmael said in Jeremiah, God, the Torah reads, or Tanakh reads, "Behold, my word is not like fire, declares the Lord, and like a hammer that shatters a rock." I'm sorry, it's a question. Is my word? Just as a hammer breaks a stone into several fragments, so too each and every utterance that emerges from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be God, divided into 70 languages. All of this is to say, right? We've got two statements that tell us that there are 70 languages, right? That there's this huge variety. This number 70 is a sense of completeness, right? We have 70 days of wailing. We have 70 languages. We've got the rabbis consider 70 to be a full life, right? So we've got all these numbers telling us about 70. Then we have this super interesting comparison, which will be relevant in a moment, in which Rav Chanan al Bar Papa makes the point that has this verse, listen, for I will speak royal things. I want you to highlight the royal there, and my lips will open with upright statements from Proverbs. And we have this analysis between words and royalty. And here the conclusion in the context of Masechet Shabbat is that Torah and sovereignty, right, a king or a queen or whatever, that what it has is authority over life and death. Is everybody with me so far? I know this feels like a non sequitur. Sheila, none of it's working for you.
No, it's too, I understand what they're saying,
Got
but
it.
they're pulling it a little. I mean, it's like, again,
Yeah, this is
it's
a
like when
very
they were in the store talking, buying food for the bar mitzvah.
yes.
I
It's
mean,
definitely on the very interpretive side. Yeah, Nelson.
Well, I looked up Psalm 68:12, and it says armies, it doesn't say women, or at least the translation I saw.
Yeah, well, we have this amazing tool. Let's look it up together. This we already know. We're already in a very different mode here. All right, so let's look at Psalms, right? And we're going to open it up. This is the beauty of Safari. If you haven't used Safari yet, here's the answer. So it says Adonai Yiten Omer, right? The Lord gives a saying, Hamivasrot Tzevarav. It doesn't specify women. I'm not sure why it says women there. I'm not complaining either. But it's I don't know where it was. There it is. Let's see what it has to say. What does Rashi tell us here? It doesn't make a specification.
Wait a
So let's
minute.
not get lost.
What is it? What is it? Proverbs?
It
You're
is
looking-
Psalms 68:12. Okay.
Psalm 68:12.
Correct. You can see again. I put the link to the whole sheet inside the chat. All right, Nelson, did you have a point you wanted to make with that?
No, I was just wondering, Sheila was confused, and now she should be. She knows this stuff better than I do.
Yeah.
Excuse me, this is JPS, and they also say translated as women.
My guess.
This is an old translation,
Yeah,
but
my
they say
guess is Amavisarot, like Besorot Tovot are like good tidings, and my guess is they're playing a little bit with that. They're playing with that pun. My guess is also like maybe they're making tzava, armies, into like feminine somehow, but I'm not sure. I don't want to get lost in it because it's not really relevant to our conversation. But Nelson, I think your point is well made, as well as Sheila. Right? It's a phrase. This is a strange phrase, which is probably why the rabbis have an alternative there. David and Karen, did I see your hand up or no? No. Okay, David.
So I think maybe this is just another one of those cases where the rabbis want to make some kind of point and they want to make it through a verse, and they're bringing verses more or less out of context to make whatever that point is, which I guess we're getting to. So yeah, I think it's confusing, but I guess maybe the point is whatever point they're going to make when we get there in a minute or two will be clearer than the verses they chose to make it.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting because it's really I worked backwards, which is to say that the verse led me to an interesting piece of Talmud, and then I found something else to add, which is this one. This is the last edition, so this is going to give us color for the section I really am excited to read, which is what we're going to do now, which describes an interaction between Pharaoh and Joseph. And Nelson, I think you originally pointed out the court dynamics, and that's going to be you drew that out in a way that I didn't notice, and it's perfectly relevant. So here we have this section from Masechet Sota, and we're going to read it paragraph by paragraph. Can I get a volunteer to read the first paragraph? Right, this one's a little bit longer. Somebody who has.
I'll read if nobody else will.
Okay. Anybody else wants
Anybody
to? Sheila. All right, Sheila, go for it, and then we'll
Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, when Pharaoh said to Joseph, and without you no man shall lift up his hand or his foot in all of the land of Egypt, Pharaoh's astrologers said, you will appoint a slave whose master bought him for 20 silver coins to rule over us? Oh, so we find out how much they paid for him. He said to them, I perceive royal characteristics, Ginunei Malchut in him, and see that he was not initially a slave.
Okay. Rabbi Chia bar Abba quotes Rabbi Yochanan, who quotes this verse from Genesis, which is from, I think, 2 parshas ago. Right, without you no man shall lift up his hand and all his foot and all the Egypt, giving sort of this moment in which Joseph acquires power. And the rabbis add that that Pharaoh's astrologers were flabbergasted by this, by saying, you're going to appoint a slave over basically to rule over us, right? This sort of a subversion of authority and power. Now, God willing, we don't live in such a class system today, although there's certainly some elements of it worthy of exploration, which is not really the focus for today. But what's interesting is that Pharaoh says to the astrologers, I perceive royal characteristics in him. Now, here's the question before we go on. What do you think the royal characteristics refer to? Yeah, Nelson.
Certainly he can interpret dreams, and he has dreams, and that's like a royal sign.
Got it. So, right, God gives him the power of dream interpretation, and that has a royal element to it. Cool. I like that. David, and then Karen.
So I think 2 other things. I don't know whether these are necessarily per se royal, but they could help a royal. One is he seems to be charismatic. People more or less like him. The second is that, and we could give examples if we need to, but the second is he seems pretty good at organizing things. Every time he's been liked and been put in charge of anything, it seems to prosper. He knows how to organize a household. He knows how to organize ultimately a country or even a region or maybe the whole world. So I would offer those 2.
All right, so you said 2 that, right? So first is that he's got charisma, and second, he seems to be good at his job, right? He seems to be effective. He runs Potiphar's house and he runs the prison, right? Like he's given responsibility and authority, and he's successful with it, right?
And he herds the sheep. That's where he starts out.
Sure, right, and certainly he is critiquing his brothers in doing so. Karen, and then Bob.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about the brothers. He's a little full of himself, which is probably why the brothers, it's more than just the coat. It's probably his attitude. He's always had that attitude.
And the attitude is a royal one.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit arrogant.
Arrogant,
and
that's the word. Yeah, arrogant was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
I love it. Right. Royalty has some arrogance to it. I love it. All right, Bob.
I would think that someone with a slave mentality would be just following orders, and that for someone to have leadership attributes would be someone who was independent in thought and action.
Right. So his creative problem solving, as opposed to just following the instructions, gives him a royal characteristics.
Yeah.
I think also,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sheila.
Fin-
Oh, Sheila, please.
I think also that the astrologers are jealous. I mean, they say he's a slave. He's not one of them. And that bothers them. They do not know Joseph. And they could not tell the dreams.
That's
and
what
Joseph could.
Yeah, so potentially they're saying this guy who came out of nowhere, who's doing our jobs better than us, you're going to put him in charge? Certainly there's some dynamics there. Here's where let's see what the Gemara has to say. They say, okay, royal characteristics. They said to him, if that is so, right? So they, the astrologers, say to Pharaoh, if that is so, that Joseph has royal characteristics and he is a child of royalty, he should know the 70 languages that all king's children learn. All right, so first of all, we have a couple of things that we're learning, right? That there are 70 languages that all the king's children learn, right? So if you're royalty, you speak all languages, right? We just said 70 languages are all the languages. So therefore, the angel Gabriel then came and taught him, Joseph, the 70 languages, but he could not learn all of them, right? So Gabriel comes down, attempts to teach Joseph all, because he didn't come from royalty, all of the languages, but it didn't work. So then Gabriel then added one letter to Joseph's name, the letter Hey, from the name of the Holy One, blessed be God, and then he was able to learn the languages. As it is stated, he appointed it in Joseph Yehoseph for a testimony when he went forth against the land of Egypt, the speech of one that I did not know I heard, from Psalms. So here we've got a couple of things happening in a verse, which is we have this verse where Joseph's name has an extra letter, which is a Hey. We've got this reference to Egypt, and we've got a reference to speech. So the rabbis are interpreting that that Joseph has this moment where he becomes Yehoseph, and he gets a letter added to his name, and he's there somehow able to learn all of the languages. Now, again, let's be really, really clear. The rabbis are telling a story. This is not meant to be a direct and clear interpretation of the text. This is midrash, if you've ever heard it. Yeah, Sheila.
Interesting. If they could speak 70 languages, why couldn't they speak Hebrew? And if they could speak Hebrew, then they would have understood Joseph talking to the brothers and whatnot, the whole conversation.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that.
It says that could you move it up one? It might answer it.
We haven't finished reading yet.
I think when you read on, you're going to find out there was a 71st language, and that was the Hebrew.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
you guys spoilers here. All right, let's keep reading, and then you can come back. Let Sheila hold on to it. Okay, we're not there yet. So Gabriel teaches Joseph the 70 languages. So therefore, he knows all the languages. The next day, when he appeared before Pharaoh, in every language that Pharaoh spoke with him, referring to Joseph, Joseph answered him, Pharaoh. Then Joseph spoke in the sacred tongue, Hebrew, and Pharaoh did not know what he was saying. The 71st language, Ron, you pinned it right there, and Sheila, you're making reference to it. And Pharaoh did not know what he was saying. Pharaoh said to him, teach me that language. He taught him, but he could not learn it. Pharaoh said to him, take an oath for my benefit that you will not reveal that I do not know this language. And he took an oath for his benefit. So what happens? Joseph, who would not have originally been able to learn all the languages, is given a divine gift by Gabriel to learn all the languages. And that turns around when he speaks to Pharaoh, he speaks one more language than Pharaoh does, who can't learn it. Now, Hebrew is a complicated language, but it's not more complicated than all the other languages. And clearly we have some divine intervention here happening about Pharaoh's capacity to learn language. And according to this, Joseph says, that there's a promise made, and Joseph is not going to reveal that Pharaoh doesn't know Hebrew. Yeah, Bill, you were going to say something. Hold on, let's unmute you.
This whole thing doesn't make any sense to me. How can anybody learn 70 languages?
Yeah, well, barring the number of languages, right? First of all, we certainly have a tremendous number of languages happening here. I think the rabbis are really imagining more than anything else is the 70 is representational. It's representing that if you are you're in royalty, you have to speak the languages of everyone you might encounter, right? And we're talking about a tremendous number of languages. Whether it was actually 70 or not is unlikely.
Yeah.
But I do. Yeah, sorry, Bill, please.
And the second thing, can you learn a language that quickly? I guess I'm just too literal.
Yeah, this is definitely not a literal story.
And why does Pharaoh have a private meeting with Joseph?
Right. Well, let's come back to that too. So, so I think, Bill, to your point, right, that this is some sort of magic God intervention here, right? This is beyond the normal realm of language learning because Gabriel, this angel, is coming down and teaching Joseph. But very much, we should be skeptical of this dynamic of what's happening here. Nelson, Bob, and then Sheila.
I'm okay now.
I think this is a seasonal story. Pharaoh could not pronounce Hanukkah.
I like it. Clearly, we have some sort of thing here in which Joseph has something that Pharaoh does not, right? And that creates tension, real tension. Yeah, Bob.
I don't know Hebrew. Does that qualify me to be Pharaoh?
I love it. Perhaps, how many other languages do you know? I'm just kidding. Clearly, we have this. This whole the stories here on some level are about subversion. They're subverting our expectations. That's what this story is doing, right? We have this, shepherd child whose family is incredibly wealthy, sorry, I don't mean to have things beeping. Oh, I'm not doing that now. So forgive me if it continues to beep. And he is given this incredible power over Egypt, and he ends up having basically power over Pharaoh, which is tremendous. There's a real tension here, and I think we identified this tension in the biblical text when Nelson pointed out, right, this whole court dynamic. Right, there's a real tension here. Let's keep going because we haven't even gotten to the part that connects to our parsha, and here it is. We're going to get the resolution of our story here. Years later, when Joseph said to Pharaoh, right, because remember, there's all those years of the famine, right, or there was the 7 years of plenty, and then I think the famine begins, and the Jacob and his family come down around 2 years in. Hold on, I'm gonna stop this for a second so I can take off the sounds here. Great. I lost the screen. Here it is. Okay. So it's been probably close to 10 years later, certainly, when Joseph has power, and we have this moment years later when Joseph said to Pharaoh, "My father made me swear," which we saw above, "that I would bury him in Eretz Israel." You can see Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary here. He's taken out. It doesn't say where location, but he's at Eretz Israel versus Canaan. Okay. Pharaoh said to him, "Go request a dissolution of your oath." Right. So Joseph makes his promise. He says to Pharaoh, I'd like to go. And Pharaoh said to him, and it doesn't say Pharaoh, that's Rabbi Steinsaltz, "Go request a dissolution of your oath." So maybe we'll plug in different things where it's said to him. It could be to the court. Maybe we're hearing the tension where it's being resolved. I don't know. Go request a dissolution of your oath. Joseph said to him, "Should I also request dissolution for the oath that I took for your benefit?" And consequently, even though Pharaoh was not amenable to letting Joseph go, maybe foreshadowing in some way, he was worried that Joseph would then request dissolution for the oath that he had taken for his benefit, about the languages. And therefore, Pharaoh said to him, "Go up and bury your father according to what he made you swear," which is that last verse that we read. Meaning to say, what is the rabbi? I'm going to skip all the way to the top again. We go back to the biblical text. Here it says, "Therefore, let me go and bury my father." And Pharaoh agrees. What is it that we know the rabbis are feeling about this moment? They're incredulous. They can't believe that Pharaoh agreed to this. And that's how we find ourselves with this story, which is they can't imagine that Pharaoh would just agree out of the kindness of Pharaoh's heart, even though this is not the same Pharaoh from later. There's this tension saying this couldn't possibly be. There must be more to the story. And here we get the rest of the story, which is that Pharaoh, that Joseph had this thing over the Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh wanted Joseph to not leave, Joseph was able to leverage that and sort of blackmail him in some way. Ron, I saw that you unmuted. Is there something you want to add? Oh, maybe not.
That was actually an accident, but I don't know. I thought maybe you were asking earlier. I think Jacob was in Egypt 17 years before he died.
Okay, great.
Something along those lines.
Yeah, great. I'm very much glad that sounds right. My only point was that we're talking about from the moment that Joseph came into power to at least the time that he encounters his brothers is 9 years at least, let alone how much more time they spent in Egypt. But yeah, we're talking about decades here, certainly. David.
So, and I apologize if I'm not being heard that well. Apparently my internet connection might not be stable, but two things occur to me. One is sort of the context of the rabbis versus our context, and the other is what they're trying to make of this. So for our context, we have the benefit of some archaeology and historical studies, understanding of some of the Egyptian language, for example, that may not have existed at the time the rabbis were writing, or at least may no longer have existed because the whole area had been Hellenized. What I think is interesting is they're really looking hard to find a pharaoh that doesn't want to agree with Joseph, whereas we might say, well, this is a Hyksos pharaoh, somebody whose people come from the same part of the world that Joseph comes from. It's now well established through historical and archaeological sources that people were coming and going frequently during that intermediate period in ancient Egyptian history. Sure, this pharaoh could like Joseph and actually give him a lot of power, and they could even be relatively buddy-buddy, including the court, which probably consisted of some native Egyptians, but also some Asiatics. We can at least presuppose based on what we know about the Hyksos. So we could sit here and say, okay, the story on its face makes some sense to us, but the rabbis don't think it makes sense in their context, so they have to reach for this. I mean, I think that's maybe what's going on. That doesn't mean we can't learn something from it. Of course we can learn something from it, but it's just interesting what a change in general knowledge and context will do for our viewpoint. And we're all creatures of whatever period we're in, so we all are influenced by that to, in a sense, inform our viewpoint anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right, which is a literal, like a surface reading of the text. This pharaoh seems amenable and reasonable and willing to let this person who he has empowered for decades do what he needs to do for his family. The surface reading of the text would lead us there, but that's not where the rabbis take it. They are uncomfortable with this idea that Pharaoh would just agree and give Joseph this opportunity. And they have this whole rigmarole, this whole story in which Joseph has leverage over Pharaoh. You're absolutely right to say this clearly speaks, I think, to the mores of the rabbis of the time, that their understanding of international relations, if you will, right? It might be that during this time, the dynamics between Babylonia and Egypt are not so good, so they're incentivized to think negatively about Egypt. Who knows? But certainly, I think this is not a surface reading of the text. They are adding information. They're adding language and tension, which we can probably see hinted to with the whole court thing. We could say, well, maybe didn't want to talk to him. There was a fight between them. Who knows? We could add all sorts of extra details, but it's definitely not a surface reading of the text. Bob. Oh, can't hear you.
Could this story just be a metaphor to say that he had leverage over Pharaoh?
What do you mean?
That it didn't actually, that there was no 70 languages, that the rabbis had to figure out a way to have Joseph have leverage. So
Yeah,
they come up with a miracle to make an explanation that would fit their thought process.
yeah. So I think that's
to come up with leverage.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what's happening, which is that we've got two parts here. The first part is they can't believe that Pharaoh said yes. So they have to figure out a reason why Pharaoh would agree to this. And arguably that could be leverage. It could be, they could have described this profound and deep relationship that Joseph and the Pharaoh had. Used to go on long walks on the beach. They could have, had tea and coffee together. They might prefer to bake, hamantash, whatever, right? That was very anachronistic. But certainly they could have taken it beyond surface value. They chose to describe it as a tension-filled negative relationship. And when they've done that, they said, okay, Joseph has some leverage over Pharaoh. Then they have to come up with a story as to what that leverage is. And it could have been a lot of other things. Here, right, they've added the astrologers level. They've talked about the Gabriel thing. Like, they've added tons of story and detail. And it makes us wonder, what other stories did they know? Were they making other types of connections? I can imagine, right, they are giving reasons for why pharaohs in general don't like Israelites, and therefore they're making adding the tension here. So I think there's a lot. They're very much adding information, and there's a lot here. Karen and then Nelson.
I hear a lot of echoes of Moses. Let him. Moses says, let them go, and Pharaoh says no. And something else you said before, I forgot. I hear just lots of echoes of Moses, and so the rabbis are looking at this story, saying, "Wait a minute, why would Pharaoh be so amenable here?" And that's all.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think we should be hearing those echoes of Moses here, right? Let me and my people go. Right, this tension with Pharaoh, the fact that Joseph is very embedded in Egyptian leadership life, just like Moses was. First of all, I think those stories have what to learn from each other in general. Here, I think
and the astrologers not being able to keep up with the same, whatever you want, magic tricks as Moses.
I think you're exactly right. There are certainly these stories inform one another. And the rabbis are clearly holding these stories in parallel, because it doesn't make sense to read all of this negativity into it unless you have the Moses story in your back pocket, which hasn't happened yet, again, in the narrative. It's one of the reasons why Rashi often says there's no beginning or end to right, or Torah is not in order, whatever the phrasing he uses. Nelson and then David.
I see the sort of a connection in real politics. So maybe Mordecai in the Purim story, Joseph, Moses, don't make promises that are effective only if they're kept a secret. You're going to get blackmailed. Just a warning.
That is a cool takeaway, right? Don't make promises that can be held against you, right? Be transparent. And obviously there's the political element, right? I think we've already made the connection from a few weeks ago between Joseph and Mordecai, those two stories. So like, it's great that you've added that. Yeah, I love that, right? Someone could have leverage over you. So do business honestly, transparently. I'm adding to what you said. I know you said something more broadly. David, I think I saw you.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Karen had said, that I think ties in with this whole business of the context, because the rabbis are at a time when Rome is already ascendant and obviously very against us and against them, if you will. They're living, on the other hand, in the East, where Persia's in control, and maybe Persia in the end of the day isn't so friendly either, maybe a little friendlier than Rome, but that's not saying much. Certainly a little more tolerance, so the rabbis have an opportunity to flourish in a sense. But nobody Jewish is in control of much of anything. And I think that reads back into this in interesting ways, not the least of which is that unlike Moses, who's leading his people out, Joseph has to promise he's coming back. I mean, he explicitly says, I'll go bury him and then I'm coming back. He doesn't even bother to say that I'm taking out my brothers also because they're also his children and they want to bury him. And this whole entourage goes up, as I recall, when we read about that, including some Egyptians. I imagine that when I read it, I say, oh, you know, they're honoring Jacob because he's the father of the vizier. All these people are going up, including Egyptians, Egyptian officials. But I can imagine the rabbis in this case reading back into that, and just to make sure he keeps the promise, we're sending up officials who are soldiers. And the soldiers are going to watch this whole thing and then make sure when the funeral's over, everybody really does come back.
Yeah. I mean, like to the point Nelson's making, there's a real politique element to this, which is let's make sure that people really follow through. Don't make promises you can't keep, or don't make them in private, things like that, that there's a real sense, potential sense, right, that we don't trust each other. And we need to assure that get followed, that we have power over one another. By the way, I would argue that I think this is a very negative way of looking at relationships. I would argue that I'm not suggesting any of these things. Like, don't have a list of blackmail on your friends. Not a great thing to do. It's not good for friendships to have blackmail. Just putting it out there. But I do think we get a sense, you know, of the rabbis in Babylonia, you know, are communicating with people in Eretz Israel, certainly who have been dispossessed of the land. They're going to be very skeptical of external leadership. Now, that being said, the rabbis really liked being in Babylonia. The ones who were in Babylonia had the option of living in Eretz Israel and chose not to. So again, they're very much diaspora focused, but they're going to chafe under the authorities around them and going to be uncomfortable. And certainly history would prove that discomfort has validity to it. Sheila, last word, and then we're
All right, I don't know whether this is what the answer is, but I'm just curious. How much did the rabbis know about the ancient history, like the Akkadians and the Sumerians, even ancient Egypt, except what's in the Bible, what they have written down? And you have this group, Jacob and his father and Joseph. Well, let's leave Joseph out of it because he wasn't part of it originally. But Jacob, you have these nomads who have gotten very rich. There must have been a lot of people, a lot of groups like this all over the area. Some had names, and we only know their names because they're in the Bible. How much did the rabbis who are in the Talmud, how much did they know about Sumerians and all these ancient people?
It's a good question. I mean, if you include the Tanakh as a whole, the rabbis had access to most of that information on hand, or relatively on hand.
From the Bible, only
if we're limiting it to the Tanakh, they had it, whatever was in there, which has lots and lots of people names. Babylonia was a center. It was cosmopolitan. There were lots of people there. They spoke many languages. We haven't encountered much of it in our sections, but in many parts of the Talmud, they're like, oh, this word means that word in a different language, right? They really did have a sense of the world around them. So my sense is, and they could do math really well, my sense is that they were pretty well informed about the state of the world, as well as anybody might. I do want to make an important distinction, which is that our sense of sort of objective history versus a narrative history, and those are terms I'm sort of making up here, right, are very different in the sense that as moderns, we look at history, even the word history, to refer to the objective description of things that happened, as opposed to the narrative I want to tell about what happened. And I don't think ancient peoples and peoples in the time of the rabbis are making that kind of distinction that we make today. The sort of historiography that we have today is really quite a bit different than the way those stories were told before. That isn't to say that they didn't have a sense of things that happened in the past and when they happened and who they happened to and what are the consequences. Like, if you look at the story of the writings of Josephus happening at very much the same kind of time as rabbis, a little bit earlier, those stories are very much edited for the audience they're written for. And so, so I do think we should be conscientious to understand that history means different things at different times. But I do believe that my sense, I don't have any data, I'm just telling you my sense. My sense is that the rabbis did have a broad understanding of what was happening in historically, what had happened with all these smaller peoples. Whether or not they paid attention to different groups, I don't know. I would also point out that as difference to Sumerians existed at the time of the rabbis, right? They still exist, right? So there are lots of these small peoples that probably did exist at their time. They don't exist in ours. And part of that is the homogenization of human culture and other kinds of things that are certainly happening now.
I just need to piggyback on that just a little bit for the sake of clarity, and I'll just throw this in. By the time the rabbis of the Talmud are discussing it with each other and it's finally getting written down, I don't know that there would have anybody yet who would remember that there were such things as Sumerians and Akkadians, et cetera, because they're long buried and there is no archaeology yet. Those groups are literally gone from that part of the world. And what's in Babel, although that we still are using the same word, is a different group of people speaking a different language and with a different religious background, et cetera. That doesn't mean the rabbis didn't know a lot, because as you've observed, they write a lot about things mathematical, et cetera, and so forth, that Europe lost and had to rediscover. So they certainly knew things that had been forgotten, but it's also likely that they didn't know other things that have been forgotten and didn't get rediscovered until the 19th century of the Common Era. So that's a little more context.
Yeah, I would just add a little distinction where, the rabbis do certainly have references to Akkadian language, and Tanakh makes, Jeremiah makes reference to the Greek destruction of the first temple. So there is a sense that these things are known, maybe not the details, maybe not the archaeological accuracy that we have today, whatever. They're certainly going to know that peoples existed, maybe not the same way that we do. But yeah, I just feel as though, based on the existence of the Talmud itself, honestly, is that the rabbis were sophisticated. They were more sophisticated than we give them credit for. And that isn't to say they know everything, because certainly not, but they had a real level of sophistication that is probably not so dissimilar to what we have today in the world. Whether or not they have they don't have the internet, they don't have, the same kind, printed books or whatever, but they have a level of sophistication and a human experience that mirrors our own. They are just as human as we are. And we don't want to forget that either.
Again, for clarification, I'm not suggesting for a minute that they weren't sophisticated. I'm just suggesting that the basis of their sophistication was different. And that if we compare and contrast, maybe we can not only understand them a little bit better, but we can maybe understand ourselves a little bit better.
I think that is a well put and a wonderful way of ending our time together, because I think that's a great point to conclude on. Thank you, everybody. I thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your day.